My name is Joey Wallace. I am a professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Purdue University, Indianapolis. So in addition to my teaching and administrative responsibilities, I also run the Bone Biology and Mechanics Laboratory. And as the name implies, we study bone mechanics, which is the ability of the skeleton to effectively and efficiently bear mechanical loading, and then mechanobiology, which is the biological response to that mechanical stimulus. And we do this in the context of disease and then skeletal treatments. There's lots of diseases that impact the skeleton in a very direct way, and some of these are recognizable, things like osteoporosis, right? Everybody knows about that disease. I'm interested in diseases that are indirectly impacting the skeleton, and I like to call them sneaky diseases, because they do things to fracture risk in an indirect way when it's affecting another part of the body. And so our goal is to study those diseases and understand the underlying mechanisms driving a reduction in fracture risk to then be able to intervene to mitigate or reduce the fracture burden. So I'm really taking engineering principles, applying them to a clinically relevant biological problem, and that's really the heart of what biomedical engineering is. So kidney disease affects 1 in 7 Americans. That's 15% of us. And it really does what it does to the body through progressive damage that occurs in the glomerulus of the kidney, which is the primary filtration unit. And you can imagine that as the body's filtration system gets out of whack, all sorts of other body systems are involved, right? The primary one that people hear about is the cardiovascular system. And anytime the heart's involved, it's really easy to overlook the nasty effects that a disease like kidney disease can have on the bones. But it turns out that in addition to its role as a filter, the kidney also is the master regulator of mineral ion homeostasis in the body. And so this is things like calcium and phosphorus. They're responsible for all sorts of other things happening in the body. And as the kidney function declines, these become dysregulated. What's the body to do? Well, it turns to its internal storehouse of mineral, and that happens to be the skeleton. So it starts to remove mineral from the skeleton, which ultimately degrades the quality of the tissue that's present. But worse, it starts to poke holes all over the body. And those holes form indiscriminately in bone, but the parts that form in the load-bearing parts of the bone are real big problems. It doesn't take a biomedical engineer to know if you put holes in your bones, it's not a good thing. And it turns out that at any stage of kidney disease, there's a marked increase in fracture risk. Now, fracture on its own is a bad thing. They're expensive, time-consuming, they're painful. It lowers the quality of life of the person suffering. But in the case of kidney disease, those who fracture, 50 to 60% of them die within 1 year of that fracture. That's a crazy number, and we need to do something about it. The prognosis for kidney disease in this country is actually really bad, because it turns out that the primary driver of kidney disease, 45% of all cases in the country, are caused by diabetes. And everyone knows that there's a diabetes epidemic facing America right now. Currently, there are 37 million Americans with diabetes, and that number is expected to rise to 55 million by the end of this decade. So unfortunately, diabetes brings its own skeletal manifestations to the table. But in cases where diabetes and kidney disease exist together, there's a 400% increase in fracture risk. This is a terrible number. And so we know that these diseases come together in a comorbid way, and we know that there are skeletal interactions of both, but we're hampered because we don't possess the animal models for preclinical studies that we need that faithfully reproduce the effects of the diseases and their impacts on the skeleton. And further, patients with kidney disease or diabetes are routinely excluded from clinical drug trials. My lab has been studying comorbid diabetes and CKD for about 5 or 6 years, and we've been trying to develop these preclinical models that faithfully reproduce the metabolic aspects of each disease, but also their skeletal impacts. And with a $1.2 million grant that we just received from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, we can do that in our very much at-risk veterans population. So all of the numbers that I've mentioned about CKD and diabetes are far worse in our veterans. 25% of the veteran population suffers from diabetes, and diabetic or patients from the VA are 50% more likely to be diagnosed with kidney disease. So I really think we can and should be doing more to support those who serve for us, and I'm really excited to be working with this grant to allow us to come up with treatment options, not for diabetes or CKD on their own, but for the skeletal manifestations of those diseases.